Welcome to Tea and Clues, where every story unfolds like a warm cup of tea with a dash of mystery. Step into a world of gentle detective tales, charming villages, and clever puzzles waiting to be solved. Whether it's a quiet afternoon mystery or a cozy crime to unravel, each story is crafted to intrigue and delight, without the dark, chilling twists of traditional crime stories. What you'll find here: light-hearted yet engaging detective stories, charming villages with hidden secrets, a mix of cozy noir and classic mystery vibes. Stories perfect for relaxing and unwinding. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let's uncover clues together, because every mystery deserves a little warmth. Subscribe and join the Tea and Clues Mystery Club today. Chapter 1. The Garden Party. The sun shone brightly on the small village of St. Mary Mead as it basked in the warmth of an early summer afternoon. The streets were lined with quaint cottages, their whitewashed walls and ivy-clad exteriors giving the village the charm of a perfect postcard. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the chatter of the village's residents created a gentle hum that was as familiar as the ticking of the town's clock. It was, by all accounts, a picture of tranquility. It was on this idyllic afternoon that the village's most anticipated event of the season, Mrs. Penelope Fairweather's annual garden party, was underway. The flower beds around her sprawling property were in full bloom, the delicate petals of roses, dahlias, and sweet peas glowing in the sunlight. Villagers milled about in the lush garden, cups of tea in hand, chatting idly about their children's progress in school, the weather, and the latest gossip. Among the guests was Miss Jane Marple, as she often was at these affairs, observing the proceedings from a distance, sipping her tea, and offering occasional comments to those who sought her out. While most of the guests were deeply engaged in pleasant conversation, Miss Marple found herself observing something different. There was a subtle undercurrent of tension between some of the villagers, an unspoken unease that went unnoticed by those around her. A slight movement, a flicker of nervousness, or a too-quick glance that suggested there was more to these interactions than mere politeness. Miss Marple, with her decades of experience at reading human nature, took note of these things, but said nothing. She knew that, in time, the truth would reveal itself. As she was quietly considering the guests' behaviors, a sudden shriek broke through the hum of conversation. It was sharp, panicked, and unmistakably filled with terror. The guests froze, and the chatter halted instantly. In the midst of the well-maintained garden, Mrs. Penelope Fairweather stood, her hands trembling, staring down at something with an expression of sheer horror. Miss Marple's heart sank. She had seen the reaction before, a moment of stillness, followed by disbelief. The scream had been enough to draw the attention of the entire party, but it was the sight of Mrs. Fairweather's white face and wide eyes that told the true story. Something had gone terribly wrong. Without missing a beat, Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that the first steps in solving a mystery often required patience and observation, stood and moved toward the scene. Her small, unhurried steps were purposeful, even as the crowd began to shuffle uneasily. The guests parted to allow her through, offering concerned but distant looks. Miss Marple was well known in the village, not as a busybody, but as someone whose presence always seemed to calm the storm when the inevitable disruption occurred. By the time Miss Marple reached Mrs. Fairweather, the woman's shock had subsided into a quieter form of disbelief. Mrs. Fairweather was standing just outside, the door to her study, and her gaze was fixed on the room beyond. Miss Marple followed her line of sight. There, sprawled across the antique rug in front of the fireplace, lay the body of a man, A middle-aged, rotund man with graying hair, dressed in a dark suit that was now stained with blood. His eyes stared blankly up at the ceiling, his face frozen in a grotesque mask of surprise and confusion. The smell of something metallic lingered in the air. "Good gracious," Miss Marple murmured, her voice low but calm. "Who is this, Mrs. Fairweather?" Mrs. Fairweather's lips trembled as she answered, her voice hoarse with shock. It's Cyril Bellingham. He was the guest of honor for the afternoon tea, a friend of my late husband's. I invited him to join us after he had been away for so long. I never expected this." Miss Marple knelt down beside the body, her sharp eyes taking in the details with the precision of someone who had seen many such tragedies. "It appears he's been stabbed," she observed. "Quite suddenly, I imagine." Mrs. Fairweather nodded, her hands wringing together. I don't know how it happened. One moment he was chatting with me about the old book he had brought to show me, and then this." Miss Marple's eyes flicked back to the table where Cyril Bellingham's belongings were scattered. On the side of the table, next to a steaming cup of tea, lay a large leather-bound book. Its cover was worn with age, and it appeared to have been opened only moments before the tragedy occurred. "A book?" Miss Marple asked, her voice thoughtful. "A curious thing to bring to a garden party, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Fairweather nodded, her face filled with confusion. Yes. I don't know what was so important about it. He insisted that it had some rare, valuable information. But why? Why would anyone do this?" Miss Marple stood up slowly, her gaze sweeping over the body and the room. She was not one to jump to conclusions, but something about this scene felt wrong. There was more to Cyril Bellingham's death than met the eye. Miss Marple's mind was already sifting through the possibilities, the motives, the means, and the opportunity. "I believe this is just the beginning, Mrs. Fairweather," Miss Marple said quietly, "and I intend to find out just what secret Mr. Bellingham was carrying with him before he lost his life for it." The crowd remained silent, watching with uncertain expressions as Miss Marple surveyed the scene. No one had moved to touch anything yet, for everyone understood that Miss Marple was in charge now. Her quiet authority was both respected and feared in equal measure. As she turned to leave the room, Miss Marple caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. A faint, unusual smudge on the edge of the desk caught her attention. It looked like a smear of ink, but the manner in which it was smeared suggested that it had been done in haste, or perhaps in panic. She walked over to the desk and examined it closely. Her fingers lightly brushed the surface, and she noted the faint but distinct marks of writing, some letters just barely visible, as if they had been wiped away too quickly. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. She would need to investigate that book. But more importantly, she would need to figure out why Cyril Bellingham had been killed in such a brutal and public manner. The book held the key, but she suspected there was far more behind his death than just an old manuscript. As she stood there, turning the book over in her mind, she already knew that the story was only just beginning. This was no ordinary murder. It was a story of secrets, lies, and an untold past that had come back to haunt someone in the village. And Miss Marple, as always, would be the one to untangle the threads and reveal the truth. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The news of Cyril Bellingham's death spread quickly through the village, as such events often do, carried on the whispering winds of gossip. The tranquil and routine nature of life in St. Mary Mead had been shattered, replaced by a quiet hum of speculation. The garden party, which had once been filled with light conversation and laughter, now seemed a distant memory, overshadowed by the dark mystery that had unfolded in Mrs. Fairweather's sitting room. The village's response was immediate, and, as expected, each person had a theory, each theory a reflection of their own preconceptions and prejudices. Some thought it was an accident, an unfortunate occurrence, but that was quickly dismissed by those who had seen the body. Someone had deliberately taken Cyril's life. Others assumed that the motive was as simple as a lover's quarrel or some hidden debt that had been called in. But Miss Marple, quietly observing from the edges of the village's chatter, knew that there was more to this than met the eye. The constable, Perkins, though earnest, was clearly out of his depth. He had done his best to secure the area, but Miss Marple could see the tension in his posture, the hesitancy in his questioning. The young constable was not used to such serious crimes, and though he tried to project confidence, Miss Marple knew that his inexperience would lead him down the wrong path if not guided carefully. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Roberts, the village florist, as she hurried toward Miss Marple on the village green the day after the murder. "I just heard the dreadful news about Cyril. I simply can't believe it. I mean, he was always so polite, so harmless. He never seemed the type to, well, you know." Miss Marple, who had been walking quietly toward the market, gave Mrs. Roberts a smile. "It is a dreadful thing, Mrs. Roberts. A loss for the village, for sure." Her gaze drifted briefly to the small crowd that had gathered outside the market, their heads turned in low conversation. "But you see, Mrs. Roberts, it's the ones who seem harmless that often have the most to hide. And in this case, I believe the truth lies in those very things that most would overlook." Mrs. Roberts nodded solemnly, though she did not fully understand what Miss Marple meant. "Oh, I don't know about that, Miss Marple. I suppose, when you've lived in the village as long as we have, you come to know people. And Cyril, he always seemed harmless enough to me." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the small crowd. "Yes, but sometimes people are hiding their true selves behind a mask, aren't they, Mrs. Roberts? And sometimes that mask is what leads them to trouble." As Mrs. Roberts pondered her words, Miss Marple turned and made her way into the heart of the village. She could feel the weight of the villagers' gaze on her, their curiosity palpable. Miss Marple knew they were watching, waiting to see how the investigation would unfold. She had already noticed that some of the more outspoken villagers, Mrs. Roberts included, had begun to point fingers, focusing suspicion on the most obvious of suspects. "The constable's doing his best, but we know he'll never figure it out," Mrs. Roberts continued, her voice hushed. "Not with Cyril dead and no one knowing why. It's got to be someone from the party. I just know it." Miss Marple gave her a smile, though her mind was already a few steps ahead. "It's often the ones closest to the victim who are most affected by their death," she said cryptically. "But you're right, Mrs. Roberts. It is someone from the party, someone who was watching more than they let on." As Miss Marple walked through the village, her mind raced with possibilities. Cyril Bellingham's death had been no accident. Of that she was certain. And it was clear that someone at the garden party had been more than just a passive observer. Miss Marple's keen instincts told her that the clues would not come from the obvious places, but from the hidden spaces between the words spoken, from the movements that no one paid attention to. She could already feel the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into place, though the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. As Miss Marple passed through the square, she spotted Mrs. Fairweather standing near the fountain, her face pale and weary. She had, by all accounts, been the closest to Cyril during the party, and her initial shock seemed to have given way to a more subdued sorrow. Miss Marple, with her usual subtlety, approached the widow with a quiet greeting. "Mrs. Fairweather," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying no trace of judgment, only quiet understanding. I trust you're doing well under the circumstances? Mrs. Fairweather looked up, startled for a moment, and then sighed. I suppose as well as can be expected, Miss Marple, she replied, her voice thick with the weight of grief. But it's all so confusing. He was such an odd man. Always so. Distant. I don't know what I was thinking. Inviting him here? It seems so silly now. Miss Marple smiled kindly, taking in Mrs. Fairweather's discomfort with quiet patience. Don't blame yourself, Mrs. Fairweather. Sometimes people come into our lives, and we don't see what's really there until it's too late. Mrs. Fairweather nodded, but her eyes darted nervously to the crowd of villagers nearby, who had begun to gather in a curious huddle. Yes, I suppose so, she murmured. But still, I can't help but feel responsible. He was in my house, and I didn't think anything was wrong. I didn't see anything. Miss Marple gave a slow nod, her gaze lingering on Mrs. Fairweather for a moment longer. But you did notice something, didn't you? About the book? The one Mr. Bellingham brought with him? Mrs. Fairweather looked up sharply, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple saw something flicker behind her eyes. A flicker of memory, perhaps, or unease. I don't know what you mean, she said quickly. The book was just a book. Cyril had brought it as a sort of show and tell, I suppose. Nothing special about it, really. Miss Marple's expression softened. Perhaps, but you're not the only one who noticed that it seemed important to him. And it's my belief, Mrs. Fairweather, that the key to understanding this tragedy lies within those pages. Mrs. Fairweather turned away, her face growing paler still. I don't want to think about it, Miss Marple. Not now. I just want everything to go back to normal. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch between them before speaking again, her voice calm and reassuring. The truth always comes out, Mrs. Fairweather, no matter how hard we try to ignore it. And I believe you'll find that, in time, the answers will come from the most unexpected places. With that, Miss Marple walked away, her mind already shifting back to the other threads of the mystery. The book Cyril had brought with him. She had seen it on the table at the party. It had looked like any other old leather-bound volume at first glance, but Miss Marple now knew that it held something far more important than anyone realized. There was a secret there, hidden in the pages, one that would unlock the final pieces of the puzzle. As the villagers continued to gossip and speculate, Miss Marple knew that she was on the right track. The mystery was far from over. It was only just beginning. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The days following Cyril Bellingham's death were filled with the usual small-town bustle. Flowers were still arranged with the same care in Mrs. Roberts's shop, children played on the green, and the village clock ticked away, as it always had. But despite the outward calm, there was an undercurrent of tension. Gossip still swirled around the garden party, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of it in every conversation. The village was looking to her to solve the mystery. Though she had not yet spoken a word to the police about her thoughts, she could feel the pressure mounting. The police, led by Constable Perkins, were doing their best, but Miss Marple had seen the telltale signs of an investigation that was already being closed off too quickly. Cyril Bellingham's death had been ruled a stabbing, but motives and circumstances were still unclear. Everyone had their theories, of course. Mrs. Roberts thought it might be an old grudge. Mrs. Fairweather was convinced it was an accident gone wrong. But Miss Marple knew better than to rely on assumptions. She had learned long ago that it was the smallest details, the ones that everyone else ignored, that often held the key to the truth. Her first step was to visit the scene again. Mrs. Fairweather had graciously allowed the constable to secure the area after the body was discovered, but Miss Marple had learned that it was often wise to see the place with her own eyes. There were no more screams now, no more frantic guests, just the quiet stillness of a room that had witnessed an inexplicable tragedy. Miss Marple entered Mrs. Fairweather's study slowly, as if to disturb as little as possible. The room was well lit, despite the heavy curtains that shielded the sunlight from the windows. The small desk where Cyril had been sitting was now neat again, but Miss Marple immediately noticed the absence of something important. The book. The book that had so intrigued Cyril and Mrs. Fairweather was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, and she knew that this was not a coincidence. She took a slow step towards the fireplace where Cyril's body had been found, then turned to the desk. Her gaze swept over the area with the practiced calm that only years of observation could provide. Nothing seemed disturbed. The mug of tea he had been holding, untouched and cold, was still in place, and the rug beneath the body was pristine, as though Cyril had simply fallen into it. No struggle, no evidence of a fight, just a stab wound. It was as if someone had delivered the fatal blow with cold efficiency. Miss Marple stepped closer to the desk and found a slight indentation in the wood, a ring mark, likely from a cup. Her mind worked quickly, recalling the small details she had observed during the garden party. Cyril had been sitting near Mrs. Fairweather, speaking intently about an old manuscript he had brought with him. It seemed to be of great importance to him, though he had shared little of its contents. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed again as she walked around the room, scanning for any more overlooked clues. A slight shift in the positioning of a chair, a misaligned picture frame. There was nothing else that stood out, except the book. It was missing. "Ah," Miss Marple whispered to herself as she realized the implication. The book was gone. But why? Was it taken by the killer? Or was it hidden by someone who knew its true value? She couldn't be certain yet, but it was time to find out. Turning toward the door, Miss Marple left the study and headed for the kitchen, where Mrs. Fairweather was sitting with a cup of tea. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she tried to keep herself composed. Miss Marple had already noticed the deep exhaustion in Mrs. Fairweather's demeanor. It was clear that the stress of the past days had taken a toll on her. "Mrs. Fairweather," Miss Marple said gently, sitting opposite her, "I was hoping you could help me. I must ask about the book Cyril brought with him, the one he was so insistent about showing you." Mrs. Fairweather's eyes widened slightly, and her hands clenched the teacup tighter. "The book?" she repeated, her voice strained. "I don't know why you're asking about that now. It's just an old manuscript, nothing special." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice quiet but steady. "But it seemed important to Cyril, didn't it? You said yourself that he insisted on showing it to you. It seems to me that it might hold the answers to his death." Mrs. Fairweather's face flushed with discomfort. I don't know. He was just so persistent. He thought it would be of interest to me. Something rare. Something that had been in his family for years." She hesitated, eyes avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "But now I don't even know where it is. I've looked everywhere, but it's gone." "Gone?" Miss Marple repeated, surprised. "What do you mean by gone?" "I mean—" Mrs. Fairweather's voice faltered, her lips trembling. "It's just not here anymore. I thought it might be in his bag, or maybe he had taken it with him. But when I looked after—" She stopped herself abruptly. Miss Marple sat still, absorbing the information. It seemed that Mrs. Fairweather was not lying. She had no idea where the book had gone after Cyril's death. But someone knew where it was, and that person had to be involved in the mystery. "You said Cyril was carrying it around with him all afternoon?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes sharp. Mrs. Fairweather nodded. "Yes, he was showing it to anyone who would listen. But I never got the chance to see what was inside." Miss Marple stood up slowly. "It seems to me, Mrs. Fairweather, that this book is the key to the mystery, and I intend to find it. It's the only way we'll understand why Mr. Bellingham had to die." Mrs. Fairweather didn't respond, but her eyes followed Miss Marple as she left the kitchen. There was something more to this book than anyone was letting on, and Miss Marple was certain that once she found it, everything would become clear. But where was it now? Had it been hidden by the killer? Or had someone else taken it, thinking it might provide answers of their own? Miss Marple knew there was still much to learn about Cyril's life, his relationships, and the secrets he had kept hidden for so long. And in a small village like St. Mary Mead, it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. Chapter 4. First Suspects. Miss Marple spent the next few days observing the village with the same quiet attentiveness she always brought to her investigations. She was careful not to make herself too conspicuous, knowing that the more she listened, the more she would hear. The truth, she knew, often lay in the smallest of details, the things people were too eager to overlook or too ashamed to admit. The villagers, as always, had their own ideas about what had happened to Cyril Bellingham. Mrs. Roberts, the florist, was quick to point out that Bellingham had always been a bit of an outsider, a man with few ties to the village. Perhaps it was an old grievance from his past, she suggested, or some personal vendetta that had caught up with him. Others whispered about possible debts or illicit affairs that had finally come to light. But Miss Marple did not share these assumptions. The truth, she believed, was more complicated than any of the theories circulating through the village. Cyril's death had been swift, efficient, and almost surgical. There had been no signs of struggle, no cries for help. The killer had known exactly what they were doing. It wasn't an angry outburst. It was deliberate, and the fact that Cyril had been carrying that old book with him right before he died told Miss Marple that there was more to the story than anyone could imagine. In the days that followed, Miss Marple spoke with the villagers who had been present at the garden party. Most were reluctant to say much, still shaken by the events. But as Miss Marple gently coaxed them, she learned more about Cyril's behavior leading up to the moment of his death. He had spent much of the afternoon speaking about a book, one he claimed was filled with rare and valuable information. The guests, who had assumed it was merely an eccentricity, hadn't thought twice about it. But Miss Marple now knew that the book held secrets, and those secrets had likely cost Cyril his life. The next person Miss Marple visited was Harold Knight, the village librarian. He had been close friends with Cyril for many years, and his thoughts on the matter would be valuable. Miss Marple found him in the library, organizing a new shipment of books. He looked up as she entered, his face creased with both familiarity and concern. He had always been a quiet man, more comfortable among books than people, but Miss Marple had often found his observations sharp and insightful. "Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly, though there was a hint of tension in his voice. "I imagine you're here to ask about Cyril. It's a dreadful thing, isn't it? He was always a quiet fellow, but never one to stir trouble." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair by the desk. "But you must understand, Harold, that sometimes the quiet ones are the most complicated. I'm afraid I can't help but wonder if there was more to Cyril's life than meets the eye." Harold shifted uncomfortably, clearly not accustomed to discussing personal matters. "Well, Cyril was always a bit secretive, I suppose. He wasn't the type to make waves, But he had his interests, particularly when it came to old books. He was fascinated by rare manuscripts, especially those with historical value. Miss Marple nodded. "I've heard about the book he brought to Mrs. Fairweather's garden party, the one he seemed so intent on showing to everyone." Harold's eyes flickered nervously. "Yes, that's right. But honestly, I'm not sure what was so special about it. Cyril never told me much about it. He said it had been in his family for generations, something with historical significance. But that was all. He was always so vague about it." "Vague?" Miss Marple repeated, leaning forward slightly. "Didn't he ever explain what the book contained? What was its true significance?" Harold hesitated, rubbing his temples. "No, not really. It was always some mystery with Cyril. He'd mention a few things, but he was never clear. But—" he paused, looking around the room nervously. "There was something odd about the way he spoke about it sometimes, almost like he was afraid someone might take it from him. But I never thought much of it." Miss Marple sat still for a moment, processing this new information. There was definitely more to the story than a mere antique book. Miss Marple could feel that the mystery was deepening, and the book had to be the key. But where was it now? It had been removed from the scene, likely by the killer or someone close to Cyril. She needed to find it. The book held the answers. "Thank you, Harold," Miss Marple said gently. "Your insight is most helpful. I believe the book might be more important than Cyril ever let on. If you hear anything more about it, or remember anything else, I would appreciate it." Harold nodded, looking relieved to be dismissed. "I will, Miss Marple. I'll keep an eye out." As Miss Marple left the library, she turned the events of the past few days over in her mind. The book, Cyril's vague comments, his fear of losing it. All these details were starting to form a clearer picture, but there were still many unanswered questions. The next step would be to speak with Mrs. Fairweather again, to learn more about the specific details of Cyril's behavior during the party. But Miss Marple was certain of one thing. The book held secrets, and those secrets were worth killing for. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, reflecting on her conversations with the villagers. She had learned that Cyril had been a man with many interests, but perhaps too many secrets. The tension in his relationships, particularly with those closest to him, was becoming more evident. But it was the book that remained the central mystery. Where had it gone? Why was it so important? Miss Marple's mind was already moving toward the next phase of her investigation. She needed to gather more information about the history of the book, and, more importantly, she needed to understand why it was so valuable that it might have led to murder. The clues were scattered, but she was certain they would lead her to the truth, piece by piece. The investigation was far from over. In fact, Miss Marple knew that she had only just begun to unravel the mystery. But with each step, she was getting closer to the heart of it, the secret in the old book that had brought Cyril Bellingham to his untimely end. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue Miss. Marple spent the next few days quietly observing the villagers, her eyes ever watchful, her mind working over the details of the case. She had spoken to Mrs. Fairweather and Harold Knight, and though she had learned valuable information, the most crucial piece, the book, remained absent. It was clear to her now that the book wasn't just a trivial object. It was the key to unraveling this mystery. But where could it be? And why was Cyril so secretive about it? The villagers, though still in shock over the murder, were beginning to return to their routines, and Miss Marple knew that, with time, the truth would surface. In the meantime, she decided to take another look at the scene of the crime. She had already examined Mrs. Fairweather's study once, But something told her that there was more to discover. The subtle clues, the ones easily overlooked, were what she was after. And she was sure that something had been missed on the first inspection. She made her way to the study early one morning, before the rest of the village had fully woken. The house was quiet, and as she entered the study once again, she felt the familiar weight of the case pressing on her. She stood still for a moment, her eyes scanning the room, searching for any small detail that might have been overlooked. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the fireplace where Cyril's body had been found. The rug was still in place, but Miss Marple noticed something she had missed before. On the edge of the carpet, a faint scuff mark. She crouched down to examine it more closely. It was subtle, but it was there. A small, irregular scrape on the edge of the rug, as if something had been dragged across it. Her heart quickened. A scuff mark wasn't significant on its own, but combined with the other small inconsistencies, it began to form a clearer picture. Miss Marple gently pulled the rug back, revealing A of the wooden floor. Beneath it she found a faint mark, no more than a smudge, really, but it looked like ink. She frowned. The mark was oddly specific, as though something had been placed here deliberately. But what? And why? She reached for the desk, which had been meticulously cleaned after the murder. The spot where Cyril had been sitting was now empty, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed something that had escaped her earlier. A slight discoloration on the edge of the desk. It was faint, almost invisible at first glance, but it was there, a smudge of ink, as if someone had quickly wiped it away. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the spot, and she ran a cloth over it gently. The mark remained stubbornly intact. It wasn't a spill, as she had originally thought. It was a deliberate smear. A panic-stricken attempt to cover something up, perhaps? There was something about this that didn't sit right with Miss Marple. If Cyril had been writing or working at the desk, why hadn't he cleared it away before the party? And why had the ink been smeared in such a way? She knew from her experience that it wasn't an accident. It was intentional. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. She stepped away from the desk and walked to the nearby bookshelf, scanning the spines of the books lined up neatly. One of them caught her attention, an old leather-bound volume that looked out of place among the other, more modern works. It was Cyril's book, the one that had been mentioned at the party. The one he had been so insistent on showing to Mrs. Fairweather and others. Miss Marple pulled it from the shelf and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed with age, and the text was written in a hand that looked almost too precise, too deliberate. As Miss Marple flipped through the pages, she found something curious, a small piece of paper tucked inside. It was a note, hastily written, and it looked like it had been torn from a larger sheet. The handwriting was frantic, the words barely legible, but Miss Marple managed to make out a few key phrases. Trust no one. It's hidden in the pages. I fear for my life. They'll come for me. Too dangerous. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Cyril had been terrified. The note was clearly a cry for help, a warning about something hidden in the book itself. He had known something, perhaps someone, was after him, and he had tried to leave a trail, a message to anyone who might find it. Miss Marple could feel the pieces of the puzzle beginning to come together. The book wasn't just an object of historical value. It was something far more dangerous. As she continued to read the note, she realized that it wasn't the book itself that had been the target. It was something inside it, something hidden. The question now was, what? And who else knew about it? Miss Marple tucked the note back into the book and closed it carefully. There was no time to waste. The first step was to learn more about the history of the book. She needed to understand what Cyril had been hiding, She needed to find out who had wanted it so badly that they were willing to kill to get it. The book had led Miss Marple to a crucial clue, but there was still much to uncover. She would need to speak to the people who had known Cyril best, to learn more about his past. There were others who had secrets to keep. And Miss Marple was certain that, with time, those secrets would come to light. The investigation had just entered a new phase, and Miss Marple was repu. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The discovery of Cyril Bellingham's hidden note in the old book set Miss Marple's mind into overdrive. She carefully placed the book back on the shelf, her thoughts racing. The note was a cryptic message, but it was clear that Cyril had been desperately trying to warn someone about something dangerous, something hidden in the book. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she realized that the book was not just an innocent collection of old pages. It had become the key to unraveling a mystery much larger than a simple murder. Her next step was to learn about Cyril's past. Who had he been, really? What had he been involved in that could have led to such fear and desperation? And who had been after him? She had already begun to suspect that the answer lay not just in the book, but in the people who had been close to Cyril. Miss Marple's first stop was to visit the village records, hoping to find more details about Cyril's life. She knew that the official records would give her a glimpse into his past. Perhaps they could shed some light on his relationships and activities before he arrived in St. Mary Mead. As she entered the small, dusty room where the village records were kept, she found the familiar sight of old files and ledgers. The librarian, Harold Knight, was standing behind the counter, sorting through some new arrivals. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Harold greeted her with a warm smile. "I take it you're here about the case?" Miss Marple nodded, though her mind was already focused on the task at hand. "Yes, Harold. I've been thinking more about Cyril Bellingham. There must be more to his life here than meets the eye. I'm hoping you might be able to help me uncover some details about his past." Harold looked hesitant for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "Cyril was a private man, Miss Marple. I'm not sure there's much to tell. He didn't speak much about his life before he came to St. Mary Mead, but I suppose I can show you what we have on record." Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. "I'm sure any information, no matter how small, could be helpful. I'm just trying to piece together a picture of him." Harold led Miss Marple to a dusty shelf and pulled down an old file. He flipped through the pages, scanning the notes, and then handed her a small ledger. "This is all we have, Miss Marple. Just the usual details: his name, address, and a few mentions of his work as an antiquarian. There's no mention of family or anything personal." Miss Marple opened the ledger carefully, scanning the entries. Most of the information was dull and unremarkable. Cyril had been living in St. Mary Mead for several years, and there was a brief mention of his work in historical texts. But then her eyes caught something unusual. There was a note from several months ago, an entry that had been added hastily, almost as if someone had made a note in secret. It was brief, but it stood out. "Cyril Bellingham, affiliation with a group of antiquarians, could have dangerous connections. Proceed with caution." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. A dangerous connection. This was new information, and it opened up a whole new avenue of investigation. It seemed that Cyril's life had been far more complicated than anyone had realized. "Harold," Miss Marple said slowly, her mind working through the possibilities, "can you tell me more about this group of antiquarians? Were they local?" Harold's face darkened slightly, and he looked around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "I don't know much about them, Miss Marple. Cyril didn't speak about it. but I've heard rumors about a few men in the village, older fellows who were involved in some secretive dealings with rare manuscripts and antiquities. I never thought much of it, but now, with everything that's happened, I'm not so sure." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You think there's something more to these rumors?" Harold sighed. "I don't know. I've always kept to my books and let the village's business stay its business. But now, well, I'm starting to think Cyril may have been more involved than anyone realized. His past, it's not so clear, Miss Marple. There are a lot of things I don't understand." "Thank you, Harold," Miss Marple said gently, her voice full of understanding. "You've been very helpful. I think I need to learn more about this group of antiquarians. If Cyril was involved with them, it's possible that they know something about the book and what happened to him." Harold nodded gravely. "I'll keep my ears open. But be careful, Miss Marple. I don't know what you're dealing with, but it doesn't seem like something easily solved." Miss Marple smiled quietly and left the library, her thoughts already turning to the next part of her investigation. The mention of a secret group of antiquarians had piqued her curiosity, and she was sure that this was the missing piece of the puzzle. Someone in the village had to know more about Cyril's associations, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. As she walked through the village square, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a familiar figure standing near the fountain, Mrs. Roberts, the florist. She was deep in conversation with Mrs. Fairweather, her expression serious. Miss Marple hesitated, but then her instincts took over, and she approached them quietly. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Roberts, Mrs. Fairweather," Miss Marple said with a smile. "I hope you're both doing well after the event?" Mrs. Roberts looked up sharply, her face flushed with emotion. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's just all so dreadful. I can't make sense of it. Cyril Bellingham, he was always so odd, so quiet. And now, with the way things have turned out." Mrs. Fairweather, her eyes still red from the grief of the previous days, nodded slowly. "I know, Miss Marple. I never expected anything like this. Cyril always kept to himself, but he wasn't unkind. It's just so hard to believe." Miss Marple's gaze softened as she looked at the two women. "I understand. But I've been thinking, Mrs. Fairweather, about the book Cyril brought to the party, the one he seemed so intent on showing everyone. It's clear that it meant a great deal to him, and I have reason to believe that it holds the answers to what happened." Mrs. Roberts and Mrs. Fairweather exchanged a glance, and Miss Marple could see the unease in their eyes. They had been close to the case, had seen Cyril's interactions with the villagers. They might know more than they realized. "Do either of you know about any unusual dealings Cyril might have had?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Anything at all that might explain why someone would kill him for that book?" The two women shifted uncomfortably, but Mrs. Roberts was the first to speak. "There were rumors, Miss Marple. I don't know how much of it is true, but I've heard whispers about Cyril meeting with some men in the village. They weren't the usual sort of folks, if you know what I mean. They didn't fit in, and I heard them talking once about something hidden in a book." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Where did you hear this, Mrs. Roberts?" Mrs. Roberts hesitated, but then gave a small shrug. "I overheard them talking in the pub, not long before Cyril died. I didn't understand all of it, but they mentioned protecting the book and not letting anyone else have it. It sounded serious, but I didn't think anything of it." Miss Marple's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, and the more she learned, the clearer it became that the book was at the center of a much larger mystery. Someone wanted it badly enough to kill for it. "I think I know where to go from here," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes fixed on the two women. "Thank you both for your help. You've been invaluable." As Miss Marple walked away, she felt the weight of the case settling on her shoulders. The villagers had kept their secrets, but she was getting closer to uncovering them. The antiquarians were no longer just a rumor. They were a real threat. And Miss Marple was determined to uncover who was behind Cyril's murder and why they had killed for something hidden in an old book. Chapter 7. Another twist. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, her thoughts churning. The discovery of the antiquarians and their cryptic conversations had opened up a new line of inquiry, one that felt more dangerous and complex than she had initially imagined. The book Cyril Bellingham had carried, the one he had valued so highly, was now more than a mere object of interest. It was the center of a growing storm, and Miss Marple was determined to understand its full significance. The mention of Cyril, meeting with strange men, individuals who didn't seem to belong in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, kept echoing in her mind. She couldn't shake the thought that these figures, whoever they were, held the answers to the questions that had lingered since Cyril's death. But why had they been so secretive? Why had they come to the village, and what exactly were they looking for in that book? Miss Marple's steps were deliberate as she made her way back to the library. Harold Knight had been the first to mention these shadowy figures, but Miss Marple felt there was more he could reveal. It was time to press him further, to see if he knew anything more about the connections between Cyril and the antiquarians. The librarian had always been a quiet, unassuming man, but there was something in his manner that Miss Marple found intriguing. She had sensed hesitation in him before, and that hesitation often meant there was more beneath the surface. As she entered the library, the familiar scent of old paper and dust greeted her. Harold looked up from behind the counter, a nervous glance crossing his face as he saw Miss Marple approach. She gave him a warm smile, though her mind was focused on the task at hand. "Good afternoon, Harold," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Harold put down the book he had been flipping through and stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "No, Miss Marple, not at all. How can I help you today?" "I've been thinking more about Cyril," Miss Marple began, her tone thoughtful. "You mentioned the antiquarians he was associated with, and I can't help but wonder if you know more than you've told me. I'm afraid I'm still missing a few pieces of the puzzle." Harold shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the stacks of books around them. "Miss Marple, I've told you everything I know. Cyril didn't exactly share much about his private life. He was a solitary man, a bit too wrapped up in his own work to concern himself with others. But I suppose, looking back, there were signs that he was involved with some unsavory people." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice soft but insistent. "What signs, Harold? Anything that could help me understand what happened to him?" Harold hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a low voice. "There were rumors, Miss Marple. I didn't want to believe them, but now I can't shake the feeling that they might be true. I overheard Cyril talking to a man a few weeks ago, a man I didn't recognize. The conversation was heated. They were arguing about something to do with a book, though Cyril wouldn't say which one. The stranger was demanding it, but Cyril refused. He kept saying, 'It's too dangerous,' and 'they'll come for it if they know.' I'm not sure what it all meant, but it didn't sound good." Miss Marple absorbed the information carefully, her eyes narrowing as she thought it through. The book, again. Always the book. It was clear now that whatever it contained, it was far more valuable and far more dangerous than anyone had realized. "Did you catch the stranger's name?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but pressing. Harold shook his head. "No, I never heard it, but I'm certain he wasn't from around here. He had the look of someone who was used to traveling, someone who wasn't worried about being noticed. I remember his eyes, sharp, calculating." Miss Marple's mind whirred as she pieced the conversation together. The more she learned, the more it seemed that Cyril had been at the center of something far bigger than a simple book club or academic pursuit. Whatever he had been involved with, it had made him a target. And whoever had been after him wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. "I think," Miss Marple said, slowly, her voice thoughtful, "we need to find out more about this stranger. And about the book, of course. But I also believe there is someone in the village who knows more than they're letting on." Harold looked uneasy, glancing around the room as though unsure whether he should be speaking about such things. "I'm not sure who you mean, Miss Marple. The people here are decent enough, I think." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Perhaps, Harold, but sometimes, even in the most quiet and seemingly innocent villages, there are hidden alliances, people who, when pushed, will protect their secrets at all costs." She could see Harold's discomfort growing, and she decided to ease up. "Thank you for your help, Harold. I won't keep you from your work any longer. But I do think I'll be needing your assistance again soon." As Miss Marple turned to leave, a thought struck her. The village was small, and the EBEU people here were all interconnected in some way. There were friendships, rivalries, alliances, things that no one would ever think to mention, but that could hold the answers to the most important questions. Her thoughts wandered back to Mrs. Fairweather. She had been the first person to discover Cyril's body, and yet Miss Marple had begun to wonder whether there was more to her story than she had let on. Mrs. Fairweather's grief had seemed genuine, but could she have known more about Cyril's involvement with the antiquarians than she was willing to admit? Perhaps the woman's connection to the book was not as innocent as it first appeared. Miss Marple decided it was time to visit Mrs. Fairweather again. The book, the cryptic messages, the mysterious stranger, they all pointed to something deeper, but she could feel it in her bones. The answers were within her grasp, just waiting for the right question to be asked. Chapter 8. Another twist. The evening had descended upon St. Mary Mead, with the kind of quiet that only a small, sleepy village could provide. The streets were bathed in a soft golden light from the setting sun, the air cool but not yet cold. Miss Marple, as was her habit, made her way to Mrs. Fairweather's house with a sense of purpose. The recent revelations about Cyril Bellingham and his connection to a group of antiquarians had raised more questions than answers. But one thing was becoming clearer by the minute. Mrs. Fairweather, despite her grief, was at the heart of the mystery. Miss Marple could feel it in her bones. She had to press her again, subtly, without alarming her too much. Mrs. Fairweather was sitting by the fire when Miss Marple arrived, her face pale but composed. The air of grief had not entirely left her, but she had regained some semblance of normalcy, though there was a certain wariness in her eyes now. She greeted Miss Marple quietly, as though expecting the inevitable visit, and gestured for her to sit. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Fairweather said with a thin smile, "I was wondering when you would return. I suppose you've been following the investigation, as we all have. It's all rather overwhelming, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded and took a seat, folding her hands calmly in her lap. "Indeed, Mrs. Fairweather, I've been giving it some thought, and I'm afraid I find myself returning to one question over and over again. Why was Cyril so intent on hiding the book? And what was it that made him so afraid?" Mrs. Fairweather's expression faltered for a moment, the wariness creeping back into her features. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Miss Marple, I told you what I knew. Cyril was a private man, a man with many interests. His books were his life, and he didn't like to share them, not in any meaningful way. He was, well, he was complicated, perhaps more so than I realized. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Fairweather's face. I think you know more than you're letting on, Mrs. Fairweather. There's something about Cyril's past, something he was hiding. I can see it in the way you've been reacting to his death. The grief is real, but I suspect there's more to your relationship with him. You were close to him, weren't you? You knew something he wasn't sharing with anyone else. Mrs. Fairweather stiffened slightly, but held Miss Marple's gaze. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? That I'm suggesting nothing, Miss Marple interjected gently. I simply believe that Cyril's life here wasn't as simple as you'd like it to appear. You must know something about him, something that could help us understand what happened to him. There was a long pause. Mrs. Fairweather looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously around the edges of her shawl. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost ashamed. You're right. Cyril and I were close. Closer than I ever let anyone know. He came to St. Mary Mead not just to visit, but to hide. He was involved with people I didn't want to know about. And when they started looking for him, I feared the worst. I think he was trying to get away from them. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her voice soft but compelling. These people, this group of antiquarians, were they dangerous? Did they want something from him? Something he was afraid they might take? Mrs. Fairweather's face paled even further, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, with a tremor in her voice, she nodded. Yes, they wanted something from him. The book. He didn't tell me exactly what was inside, but he was terrified. He said it was too dangerous for anyone to know about, that they would do anything to get their hands on it. He was so frightened, Miss Marple. I thought he was being paranoid, but now, after everything that's happened, I can't help but wonder if he was right all along. Miss Marple's mind was racing. The book. It had to be more than just a rare manuscript. It had to contain something valuable, something that could not only ruin lives, but end them. She had suspected it all along, but now the truth was beginning to unfold before her, like a hidden door creaking open in the dim light. You said Cyril was hiding from these people, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. Did they threaten him? Did they say they would kill him if he didn't hand over the book? Mrs. Fairweather's eyes widened slightly. No, not in so many words, but the tension between Cyril and them was palpable. He said that if they knew where he was, they would stop at nothing to get the book. I told him to be careful. I tried to convince him to get rid of it, to let it go. But he wouldn't listen. He said it was too late for that. Miss Marple's mind was now racing through the possibilities. Cyril had been desperate to protect the book, and that desperation had likely made him a target. The group of antiquarians, whoever they were, hadn't just been interested in Cyril's collection. They had been after something specific. And now, Miss Marple was certain that someone in the village knew more about these men than they were letting on. Someone had a motive, and someone had killed too. Keep the secret hidden. Do you know where the book is now? Miss Marple asked, her voice quiet but insistent. Mrs. Fairweather looked startled, as if the question had never crossed her mind. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling. Cyril left it with me, but I never saw it after that day. It must have been hidden somewhere. Maybe he took it with him when he left that morning. I don't know, Miss Marple. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing with resolve. I believe you, Mrs. Fairweather. But I also believe that you're afraid. Afraid of what might happen if the truth about Cyril's life comes to light. I won't press you further today, but know this. The truth is always the thing that sets us free. As Miss Marple left Mrs. Fairweather's house, she felt the weight of the case shifting. She was no longer just dealing with a simple murder. This was becoming something much more intricate, something tied to the past, to secrets that had been buried too deep to stay hidden. There were more players in this story than she had initially realized, and it seemed that everyone had a reason to protect the truth. But Miss Marple was closer than ever, and she would stop at nothing to uncover what Cyril Bellingham had been hiding, and who would kill to keep it that way. Chapter 9. The reveal, the village was quiet again, as if the calm was a prelude to something greater. The bustle of everyday life resumed, though beneath the surface, things were far from ordinary. Miss Marple, having pieced together more of Cyril Bellingham's life and the shadowy group of antiquarians, felt a growing sense of urgency. Mrs. Fairweather's admission about Cyril's fear, the hidden book, the cryptic warnings, the dangerous men, had led her to a critical juncture. She now knew that the book held something much more valuable than its mere contents. But what exactly was it? And who would be willing to kill to keep it from the world? The morning air was cool as Miss Marple walked toward the small inn on the edge of the village, where she had been informed that one of Cyril's acquaintances, a man named Thomas Mallory, had been staying for the past few weeks. Mallory was known to be an antiquarian, a collector of rare books and manuscripts, and Miss Marple was certain that he had been involved in the mysterious dealings Cyril had been part of. Mallory's presence in St. Mary Mead wasn't entirely unexpected. After all, Cyril's death had created a ripple of attention in the village, but Miss Marple suspected that Mallory was more than just a casual observer. He was part of the puzzle, and she intended to see it through. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Granger, greeted Miss Marple at the door. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said warmly. "What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for a guest who's been staying here," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "A Mr. Thomas Mallory. I understand he's an antiquarian." Mrs. Granger's face seemed to stiffen for a moment, a flicker of something crossing her expression, though it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Mr. Mallory? Yes, he's been here for a few weeks now. He's up in room 3. But I must tell you, Miss Marple, he's not a man to be trifled with. He's private, keeps to himself, doesn't interact much with the other guests." "Thank you, Mrs. Granger," Miss Marple said, her voice calm. "I'll take it from here." Miss Marple made her way up the stairs, her footsteps soft against the creaking wood. She stopped outside room 3, her heart beating just a little faster, though her demeanor remained unchanged. She knocked lightly, and after a moment, the door creaked open. Thomas Mallory stood in the doorway, a tall, thin man with dark eyes and sharp features. He looked slightly surprised to see Miss Marple, but his face quickly morphed into a mask of politeness. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth, though there was an edge to it. "How can I help you?" "I was hoping to have a word with you, Mr. Mallory," Miss Marple said, her tone respectful but direct. "It concerns Cyril Bellingham. I understand you two were acquainted." Mallory's eyes flickered for a moment, and Miss Marple noticed a slight tightening around his jaw. "Cyril, yes, I knew him. A man with many interests, but none of them particularly surprising for someone in my line of work." He stepped aside to let Miss Marple in. "Please, come in. I'm afraid I don't have much to say about him that's of any value, but I suppose I can give you a few minutes." Miss Marple entered the room, which was neat and sparsely furnished. There were a few books scattered on the table, some of them old and worn, but there was nothing particularly alarming about the space. She took a seat in one of the chairs, her gaze never leaving Mallory's face. "I've been learning a great deal about Cyril lately," Miss Marple said carefully. "It seems that he was hiding something important." "A book, Mr. Mallory. A book that he believed could bring great danger. And I believe you know more about it than you're letting on." Mallory's expression shifted slightly, but only enough for Miss Marple to notice. His calm facade was beginning to crack. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but there was a slight edge to his voice now. "Cyril was an odd fellow." "Yes, but I don't see why—" "I think you do know, Mr. Mallory," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Cyril spoke of the book in hushed tones, afraid that it would fall into the wrong hands. You were one of the last people to see him before his death, and I believe you have a vested interest in what that book contains. You wouldn't be here in St. Mary Mead otherwise, would you?" Mallory's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might retreat. But instead he took a deep breath, his posture relaxing as if he had resigned himself to the conversation. "I suppose I can't hide it any longer," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I wasn't expecting someone like you to come around, Miss Marple. But yes, I knew about the book. And yes, I was looking for it." Miss Marple's eyes were sharp as she watched him. "Looking for it? What was so important about it?" Mallory hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the window, as though considering whether to continue. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now. The book contained something that could change the way people look at history. It wasn't just a collection of old manuscripts, as Cyril had led you to believe. It had information about a lost artifact, something that had been hidden away for centuries. Cyril was terrified that if anyone found out, they would do anything to get their hands on it. The book was worth more than any of us could imagine. It was worth everything. Miss Marple's heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Cyril had been hiding a secret, and Mallory had been after it. But what was this artifact, and why had it become the focus of such deadly attention? She could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on her as she spoke again, her voice steady. "So, you came to the village, looking for the book," Miss Marple said. "But someone else got to Cyril first." Mallory's face darkened. "Yes, I didn't want to hurt him. But when I realized Cyril had decided to hide it from everyone, well, I knew that if I didn't get to it first, someone else would, and I couldn't let that happen." Miss Marple sat back, taking in the full weight of Mallory's confession. The book had been the prize, the object of a deadly race between those who sought it. But now the truth was clear. Cyril had been killed. To keep the secret hidden, to prevent anyone from discovering what the book contained. "I understand, Mr. Mallory," Miss Marple said softly, her voice calm but firm. "And now, I'm afraid you'll have to face the consequences of your actions." Mallory looked at her, his expression hardening, but it was too late for him to escape. Miss Marple had solved the puzzle, and the truth was finally out. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. The morning after her conversation with Thomas Mallory, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. Cyril Bellingham's murder had been an intricately woven puzzle, and every piece she had uncovered had only led to more questions. Now that Mallory had confessed to his role in the crime, the mystery was almost solved. But something still gnawed at Miss Marple. The elusive artifact, The hidden object that had driven both Cyril and Mallory to such extremes. It wasn't just about the book anymore. It was about what the book had contained, what it had promised, and why its secrets had been so dangerous. Mallory had admitted to seeking the book out of greed and desperation, knowing that others would stop at nothing to possess its contents. But Miss Marple knew the story wasn't over. Mallory had been part of a larger, shadowy network, a group of antiquarians, and he was not the only one interested in what the book contained. His confession had been crucial, but Miss Marple could sense that there was someone else who had remained, hidden in the shadows. Miss Marple knew it was time to bring everything together. The book, the artifact, the deadly obsession. It was all tied to a single dark thread that had run through St. Mary Mead without anyone noticing. The truth was, closer than ever, but the final pieces of the puzzle still needed to be put into place. And Miss Marple had one more person to speak to, the one who had remained silent through it all, the person who had been most affected by Cyril's death, Mrs. Fairweather. Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Fairweather had been more involved in the mystery than she had let on. Her grief had been genuine, but so had her reluctance to speak. Miss Marple had already uncovered the most important facts about Cyril's past, but she had never quite understood the full extent of Mrs. Fairweather's involvement. It was time to press her once more, to get the final answers. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Fairweather's home, the cool breeze carrying the scent of flowers from the garden. Mrs. Fairweather was sitting at the same spot by the fire, her face pale but calm. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something guarded, something that suggested she wasn't as uninvolved as she had made herself out to be. "Good evening, Mrs. Fairweather." Miss Marple greeted her softly, her voice filled with quiet respect. "I know this has been a difficult time for you, but I must ask you a few more questions. I'm afraid we're very close to understanding everything, but there are still a few things left that don't quite make sense." Mrs. Fairweather hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've told you everything I know, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted Cyril to be involved in such things. But I suppose it's too late for all of that now, isn't it?" Miss Marple took a seat across from her, her gaze steady. "I believe you, Mrs. Fairweather, but I also believe you're hiding something. You said Cyril came to St. Mary Mead to hide. You knew more about him than you admitted. And now, I know there's something you're still not telling me. I need you to tell me about the book, about the artifact, and about your role in all of this." Mrs. Fairweather's eyes flickered nervously, and she looked away for a moment. The room felt heavy with unspoken words. Finally, with a deep breath, she spoke. "I didn't know the full extent of what Cyril was involved in," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "He told me bits and pieces, but I never understood the danger until it was too late. He wasn't just hiding the book to protect it. He was hiding it from the people who were willing to kill for it. And they came to him. They threatened him. And when he wouldn't give it to them, they killed him." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with focus. "Who were they, Mrs. Fairweather? Who came to him?" Mrs. Fairweather's eyes welled with tears as she looked down at her hands. "I never saw them clearly, but Cyril mentioned one name over and over, Oliver Crane, a man with connections to a powerful network of antiquarians. They were interested in more than just books, Miss Marple. They were looking for something far older, far more dangerous. The book held the key to that artifact. Cyril wouldn't tell me much, but I know now he was afraid. They knew what he had. And they wanted it. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The artifact? What was it, Mrs. Fairweather? What could it possibly be that was worth killing for? Mrs. Fairweather shook her head, tears now spilling down her cheeks. I don't know. I never saw it. But Cyril, he kept saying that whoever controlled it would have power beyond anything we could understand. He said it could change the course of history. That's why they wanted it so badly. And why? Why they killed him to get it. Miss Marple sat back, processing this new information. The artifact. It wasn't just an object of historical value, it was something far more dangerous. Something that had drawn the attention of powerful men. And now Miss Marple was certain that they were not done. They would stop at nothing to retrieve what Cyril had hidden, and they would kill anyone who stood in their way. Mrs. Fairweather was trembling now, her face pale with fear. I didn't know what to do. I tried to help him. I tried to convince him to get rid of the book. But it was too late. They found him. And now, Miss Marple, I'm afraid they'll come for me too. They'll want to know where it is. They'll think I know something. Miss Marple stood up, her face calm but resolute. I believe you, Mrs. Fairweather, and I think I know what must be done. As Miss Marple left the house, the full scope of the mystery finally crystallized in her mind. The book, the artifact, the murder, it was all connected. But the final piece of the puzzle was still elusive. There were more people involved, more pieces to uncover. The true danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. But Miss Marple was ready. The investigation had reached its climax, and with her usual calm determination, she would bring the truth to light, no matter what it took.